So here I am, another internet vampire fanboy, and what do you know? Stevie Moffat wrote a Dracula, and it had a cool ad campaign with shadows and stuff. So I had to give it a watch. But I knew I had to be careful. Moffat's done me dirty before, and he might do it again with one of my favorite novels. Boy, howdy. Something about this dumpster fire of a show stuck with me. So much so that I created a numbered list of things, arranged as close as chronologically possible through the episode, for your sake and mine, that really just confused me. Here it is. Spoilers for Dracula 1897 and Dracula 2020, and apologies for sound quality and or weird background noise. I'm a broke college student and I'm doing what I can. I think there's a train underneath us right now? I don't know. Dracula 2020, a ham-fisted analysis. In Hbomberguy's video entitled Sherlock is Garbage and Here's Why, Harry, a smarter man than myself, goes into extensive detail about how Stephen Moffat's writing style doesn't align well to writing full seasons of shows. One of these reasons, I think, aligns perfectly to 2020 Dracula. Quote, he tries to outsmart the source material. Unquote. He being Moffat. Dracula 2020 does this thing where some scenes will be taken almost verbatim from the book. For example, all of the early castle scenes have some lines taken straight from the source material. But, starting with Dracula's laboratory, stuff kind of starts to get off the rails, and it only gets more bonkers in episodes 2 and 3. I've compiled a bullet point list of things that stuck with me so perniciously that I had to spend some of the last hours of my winter break writing a 13-page analysis of episode 1. So here we go. And I'm sorry in advance. I'm an actor. I'm not someone who actually studies media. I work with media, especially in analysis of scripts and plays, but I'm by no means an expert. So, grain of salt. Thanks. Episode 1. The Rules of the Beast. Part 1. Storytelling references to epistolary format. So the episode begins in media res, or I've always heard re, but it might be in media res, with an emaciated Jonathan Harker giving his story to a couple of nuns. It's an interview between him and the two nuns, and the rest of the story, up until that point, is told through flashback. This just works. The interview with Harker harkens back to the letters and journal entries in which the book is written. It's creative and it makes sense, and I like it. Kudos, Steve. Part 2. Flies. / Did you have sexual relations with Count Dracula? Wherever Dracula 2020 is, little black flies shortly appear on the scene. I thought that was a cool piece of world building by Moffat. There's an undeniable association between vampires and disease that dates back almost a millennium. As far as asking if Dracula and Jonathan boned, vampires have a slightly less old association to sex, but one that's no less strong. That's actually the first line before the title card. The lead nun looks Jonathan Harker in the eye and asks him, "Did you have sexual relations with Count Dracula?" I totally understand why Moffat went there. Vampires, by the time Dracula is written, have come to represent sexuality considered aberrant at the time. For example, in Carmilla by Joseph Sheridan Le Fanu, Carmilla, who is a vampire in the form of a young woman, feeds exclusively on other young women. Young women function as a symbol of innocence, especially if you take race into account, which I won't hear. Shout out Lindsey Ellis, who has a great video on the topic entitled My Monster Boyfriend. The stealing of an innocent life is supposed to be super bad. Book Dracula goes one step further from the devouring of a virginal young woman and feeds a baby to his harem, which is sort of a double corruption. Not only has he corrupted the purity of these 3 young women, they themselves are now corrupt and defile further by literally eating babies. Show Dracula does something similar by feeding a baby to one of his brides in an experiment. Having Dracula, the paragon of aberrant sexuality and the corrupter of innocence, have sex with Jonathan Harker, especially when vampires already have at least one association with homosexuality, works for me. I didn't object to any of these points at all. Part 3. Blood is lives / you are what you eat. This is another really good example of Stephen Moffat needing to outsmart the source material. Dracula, in the scene where Jonathan Harker's hand gets cut because Dracula broke a mirror, literally says, "Blood is not nothing. Blood is lives." At which point, lead nun says, "Lives? You are quite certain he did not say, 'Blood is life'? He said, 'Blood is lives'?" Jonathan replies, "He did, yes. It struck me as odd." So, that's clearly a reference to Renfield's "The blood is the life, the blood is the life, and the life shall be mine." There's no reason to directly quote and then contradict the source material except to wink at the audience. The correction, or the adaptation of the exact wording, is Moffat addressing the viewer and saying, "This is not your granddaddy's Dracula." In the Stephen Moffat cinematic universe, Dracula is the oldest and most powerful vampire, because all of the other vampires lose their minds and get killed. This is because, as Dracula explains in episode 3, he's a gourmet. He only eats people he can learn something from. He literally steals the memories, habits, and languages of the person whose blood he's digesting by digesting it. He, quote, absorbs, unquote, them. Dracula's accent literally changes as he feeds on Jonathan Harker, which is more book accurate than I thought it would be, considering that both book Dracula and Moffat Dracula use Jonathan teaching him English as a pretense to hold him prisoner. Moffat's Dracula, and all the other vampires in the series, become more like the people they feed on. Cool concept, but it was specific enough that it struck me as odd. Magic loses its magic through too close an examination, I find. That's why I dislike hard magic systems. Dael Kingsmill, sorry for all the shout-outs, likes to keep her magic systems vague and evocative. I like to think that that has more narrative power, especially in a horror narrative. And we'll get to whether or not it's actually a horror narrative, because I don't think it is. Moffat's Dracula is going to England to feed on the people there. Sure, so is Book Drac. Why England specifically? It could be argued that Book Drac makes this decision because Bram Stoker considered England the center of the world, but also because it's a massive city in an empire that spans almost every continent in the 1890s. Dracula wants to go to a specific city, but Stoker doesn't give an exact reason. Moffat does. Quote, "I am looking forward to England, Mr. Harker." Dracula hasn't stolen Harker's accent at this point, so I'm going to do my best to do an impression. It'll be so-so, but here we are. "People here, they are so narrow. I wither among them. They are without flavor." And, of course, because of the air of smugness that this Dracula oozes out of every pore, he does, in fact, say flavor. And it's so weird that Jonathan Harker literally replies, "Perhaps you mean character?" It's very funny, because it has that line, from the original, "I don't drink wine." And that does actually happen later. But it's a whole thing, and it's so funny that Jonathan Harker sees this as the first red flag, or maybe not the first, but the first of many. So Dracula is going to England to feed on the people there. That's what we have determined. But he can't feed on anyone except for people of exceptional character. We get this a lot in episode 2. There's a heavy focus on doctors and such. And the peasants of Wallachia aren't enough for him? Is it just me, or does that have a weird colonial elitist bent, that the peasants of Wallachia aren't good enough for him, that he has to go to England to find people of character to feast on? It might be that he needs people of sufficient education if he wishes to retain the ability to read but I'm just not sure. Okay, moving on to part 4, The Castle. So here we see another continuation of needing to outsmart the source material, specifically in how Jonathan escapes Castle Dracula. Moffat gives the entire castle a backstory, calling it a prison without locks, which I thought that was a good way to explain how Harker gets trapped. What I didn't like was the inclusion of a secret puzzle minigame to escape. The architect, Petruvio the Widower, loved his wife and considered her like the sun, something that he would never see again. He definitely got bit the second construction was complete. So naturally, Moffat posits, there's a secret map hidden in the portrait of the wife. He figures that out because he's slow, so he has to listen better than clever people. He explains that to Van Helsing when they're talking. In the book, Jonathan just climbs down the wall. So I don't know why we have to outsmart the source material by adding this puzzle, unless it's to combat the improbability of Jonathan climbing down a big wall. But either way, we're giving Jonathan a new skill, which is that he's either good at climbing or good at puzzles. So I'm not really sure what the thing is here. Moving on. Part 5. Does undeath happen so regularly that there is a conspiracy of gravediggers keeping secrets? That seems logistically impossible. So, Jonathan encounters a crypt full of boxes which contain all of Dracula's past victims. They have to be folded and contorted to fit into these small boxes, and there's really kind of a cool scene where a zombie? It's unclear whether they're vampire spawn, to use D&D terminology, or just zombies, unfurls himself from the box and attacks Jonathan. When Jonathan tells this to Van Helsing, she reveals that the plague of undead is a secret every gravedigger keeps. Which just seems logistically difficult. The zombies are semi-suicidal. They attack the living, but they scream, "Kill me!" in the language that they spoke in life from the second they are turned, as we see in episode 3. This also struck me as odd, given that they retain enough autonomy to speak, but not enough to stop themselves from homicidally attacking the nearest person. Part 6. Dracula's Laboratory. In the book, and I use this phrase a lot, one of Dracula's biggest weaknesses, as explained by Van Helsing, is that Dracula doesn't know the limit of his powers. He discovers over the course of the novel that he doesn't need assistance moving his boxes of earth, but he only does so after moving most of them with the help of hired mortals. He's lived unchallenged for centuries. There wasn't a reason for him to have to test the limit of his powers, specifically his physical strength. Making Dracula an experimenter and a scientist not only makes him much more powerful by removing his, admittedly dumb, oversights, but it undermines one of the major themes in Dracula. The book centers on the path of destruction Dracula carves in a society, but it centers further on the people he affects. Those people have to band together, and only together can they defeat him. This isn't unique to Dracula. In Carmilla, the titular vampire is defeated only by an ensemble cast of righteous men, and we'll get to why it's men all the time. The two stories share something really important, and it's what sets them apart from their predecessor, The Vampire, with a Y, by John William Polidori. In The Vampire, the vampire gets away. Not so in the latter stories. Why? Because both Carmilla and Dracula feature a doctor. And not just any doctor, but a doctor who knows about vampires and knows how to combat them. One of the central themes of Dracula is the triumph of modern science, albeit Western, anglicized, and thoroughly Christian science, over an ancient evil. And we might touch on Bram Stoker's xenophobia later. By making Dracula a scientist, someone who uses the scientific method to explore his powers and those of other vampires, while you do add some nuance to the text, it undermines the essential themes. Which will be all right, except Part 7, the fusion of Sister Agatha and Van Helsing. So our mystery nun, our lead nun who's been sort of driving the plot, is Agatha Van Helsing. And I really don't have a problem with the dissection of Van Helsing's character and the subversion of him a bit. He represents, quote-unquote, modern science in the book, and he keeps a more open mind than even the other doctor, John Seward. He's mentally flexible, brilliant, willing to do anything to accomplish the greater good. He's the instrument by which Dracula is defeated. A master of science and an experimenter with techniques such as hypnosis to give him and his friends an edge over the ancient vampire. By making this character a woman, Moffat can combat the patriarchal association between science and rationality created by and for old white dudes. Where I disagree is making her sister Agatha, not on the grounds of actually combining Van Helsing with another character, even if she is only mentioned once, if I remember correctly. That's fine. What bothers me is this line. In answer to Dracula's question, "Who are you?" which he melodramatically bellows, having stolen Jonathan Harker's dialect by this point, she replies, "You're every nightmare at once, an educated woman in a crucifix." Which just seems a bit modern. Why is Dracula afraid of women specifically? Or is it her education, by making her non-conforming to the societal standards of the 1890s, that makes her his worst nightmare? I get the crucifix thing. That's pretty self-explanatory, though Moffat decides that actually needs to be more complicated. Welcome, my friends, to the courtyard scene. And this is where things really start to go wrong. Section the 8th. Van Helsing at the gate, / discussion of powers, / you'll never guess. On the lovely tvtropes.com, there's a description of a very special trope that is extremely common in a lot of anime. I found the appearance of this trope in Dracula to be a little disturbing, to say the least. The way that Dracula 1897 deals with the problem of expositing Dracula's powers to the audience is by having Dr. Van Helsing already know said powers and explaining them to his oblivious party members. Quote, "He has in his hand the strength of 20 men, for example. Van Helsing knows and relates that information to the audience. By showing the first meeting of Van Helsing and Dracula, or, more accurately, by having the confrontation at the gate be the first meeting Van Helsing has ever had with a vampire of Dracula's magnitude, we need another device of explaining Dracula's powers to the audience." And there are a couple of problems with that. And that's not to say necessarily that Book Van Helsing has ever actually encountered a vampire before, but he's done enough research that he can relate it to the audience. And I'm sure that Dracula 2020 Van Helsing has done a similar amount of research, but instead of having an exposition scene where Moffat relates the information to the audience through Van Helsing, instead he chooses to have it during their confrontation. The first of our major problems with Moffat's method is that the audience already knows Dracula's powers, or at least they think they do, and the show actually does take advantage of this misconception with the climax of episode 3, which I'll get to. The larger problem is that the method by which Moffat handles the explaining of Dracula's powers is most closely related to what TV Tropes calls, quote, "explaining your power to the enemy," unquote. Earlier in the courtyard scene, one of the nuns rings the bell to summon out all the other nuns to defend the courtyard from Dracula. Dracula snarkily quips, "I don't know what legends you've been reading, but bells don't have any effect on me." It's not quite like the psychotic boasting we get from Book Dracula, which helps to cement him as a bloviating monster. It's quippy, and it sets the tone for the rest of the scene. And I'll get to tonal dissonance in a second. My larger problem is that this scene, which is 8.5 minutes long, and the source for the name of the episode, is dedicated to Van Helsing goading Dracula, prodding him in an attempt to determine the limits of his powers. Van Helsing opens the iron gate for Dracula, but expressly forbids him to enter. Dracula cannot cross the threshold, and she says, "So it's true then. That's interesting." Mother Superior, "What is?" Van Helsing. A vampire may not enter an abode unless invited in. I wasn't sure about that one. I'm making cuts to Mother Superior's lines for the sake of expediency. Dracula. You unlocked the gate and you weren't sure. Van Helsing. Oh, the iron wasn't keeping you out. You could have torn it apart like match wood. Dracula. I could tear you apart. Van Helsing. Not from out there, you couldn't. What's stopping you? A feeling? A force? Is it physical or mental? Why do you need an invitation? Okay. So Van Helsing is trying to define Dracula's powers so that she can find a weakness and potentially destroy him. Yeah. Sure. This section not only succumbs to the rising JoJoism of this show, which by episode 3 is running rampant, but plays only a minor role in the first few episodes, but more importantly, falls into one of the writing traps as defined by Hbomberguy. Now, this quote is about Sherlock, but again, it applies. Quote, the entire show is dedicated to telling you about Sherlock instead of showing you Sherlock by way of his interaction with the actual plot. We could define Dracula's powers without having a lengthy conversation about it. Dracula is the protagonist of this show, so we can just literally watch this happen to him and watch him display his powers without him having to explain the function of said powers. Moffat makes the mechanics of Dracula's abilities pivotal at several points during the show, and that contributes to said anime tropes, and we'll get to how later. In order to build large plot elements, they're coming in later installments, around the functioning of someone's powers, you need to devote time to discussing said powers. Having two scientist characters discussing the powers would make a lot of sense. And hey, that's how Bram Stoker does it. He has two doctors, Seward and Van Helsing, literally talk about how vampirism isn't possible, and then Van Helsing gradually demonstrates it by killing Lucy Westenra. So maybe a little less than gradually. But he proves that vampires are irrefutably real by showing them a vampire and then murdering it in front of them. We even get a display of the vampire's abilities, with Van Helsing doing a little bit of anime shot calling as Lucy Westenra slides into the tomb. But again, it's a matter of showing, not telling. By having this conversation be between two people who are literally fighting, you lock yourself into the style of two people describing their abilities as they fight one another. You have to describe the moves as they're happening, or you have to have a scene later where they talk about it. And it gets worse. Van Helsing says that Dracula is afraid of the cross because, quote, it speaks of a holy virtue, she says, you do not possess. It is, quote, goodness incarnate. Dracula replies, all sneers. For a moment there I thought you were clever, but no, that's not why I fear the cross. Goodness has got nothing to do with it. That line kind of smacked me in the forehead, because that line happens in the same location in the narrative as when all the doctors guess wrong and Dr. House says, no, morons, it's not cancer. Or, again, pounding on that tonal dissonance and the genre dissonance when you think Joseph Joestar is defeated, only to find out that he's used his powers to turn a cactus into a bomb. It's the fake-out. No, that's not why I have my weakness, you utter fool! Part 9. Tonal Dissonance. Dracula 2K20 does not know what kind of show it wants to be. It has some strong, really strong horror elements. Dracula transforms into a wolf, and then, rather than just shape-shifting like a normal Dracula, he rips himself naked out of the body of the wolf, all while the wolf whimpers in pain. He's covered in blood, and it's pretty spooky, as well as being a really cool take on the transformation. Unfortunately, Moffat loves nothing more than he loves quippy banter, and Dracula, still waist-deep in wolf, looks over at the petrified nuns and says, while he runs a hand over the body of the wolf, which is still warm, I don't know about you girls, but I do love a bit of fur. It gave me whiplash. I was completely stunned. That choice completely undercut any horror in the scene. And so did when Dracula asks why the nuns can't look him in the eye. And Van Helsing replies, "You're naked, and they're nuns. It isn't your eye they're not looking at." It's not a horror piece. Dracula is the protagonist. He's also too funny and weird for the horror elements to be effective. It's not a comedy, and there's not enough action for it to be an action flick. Is it a mystery? Is this just Sherlock with bat wings? Part 10. It's Mina! Surprise! Hey, remember that second nun? The one in the room when they're interrogating Jonathan and there's two nuns and one of them's Van Helsing? Well, the other one's Mina. I actually liked that choice because not only does it allow for Jonathan and Mina to have an emotional moment, but it actually happened in the book. Great. Part the 11th. Vampires can't kill themselves. So here's where the "this ain't your granddaddy's Dracula" starts to be a bit bothersome. Not because of the actual rule reversal. Vampires not being able to kill themselves isn't actually that important. But at this point, Jonathan stakes himself through the chest, something that speaks to his character's obvious tenacity and kindness. He would rather kill himself than risk Mina's safety. It's played for maximum drama, complete with swelling instrumentals and Mina, tears running down her face, holding a long sword to keep her beloved husband at bay. It's a little touching. And then Dracula slithers up the wall outside and through the window reminds Johnny Blue Eyes, which is a name that has just been introduced. Now Dracula's called Jonathan Johnny, which nobody calls him except for Mina, but he's never called him Johnny Blue Eyes until Mina reminded everyone that that's what she calls him like 5 minutes ago. So he slithers up the castle wall and says to Johnny Blue Eyes that the undead cannot kill themselves. That whole heroic sacrifice that Jonathan Harker just did is completely just negated by Dracula's powers. Sure, I guess. I mean, for the sake of the you can't tell where the plot's going, woo, reversals, I guess, but I mean, we had an emotional moment and we actually liked Jonathan Harker, which is hard to pull off, Stephen. Kudos. It is hard to make people like Jonathan Harker because he is a boring, boring man. So not only did Stephen Moffat make us like Jonathan Harker, he then made Jonathan Harker have a complete and very effective plot arc and then completely negated that plot arc by making him not actually dead. Dracula then forces Jonathan to invite him into the nunnery. And this is where the car that flipped in the courtyard scene catches fire. Part 12. Obsession with Sunlight. We've all seen Interview with a Vampire. It's become cliché at this point, I thought, to have Dracula lie his cloak down on the stone floor, just in the shadow, next to Jonathan, who is lying in the bright sunlight, and ask him to describe it. Also, this is a humanizing moment for Dracula. We have parallels between him and Petruvio, the architect, who loved his wife as the sun. It's the one thing he can never see again. But it's sort of undercut by all these snarky little quips. Stephen, quote, "Describe her to me. I've had artists, painter, and poets describe her in words, and Mozart wrote such a pretty little tune. I really should have spared him, but what does a lawyer see?" Of course, Dracula's the kind of guy who would gender the sun, though in this case he refers to Jonathan as a bride, so he's got sort of a record of playing with the assumed gender of words. But the little Mozart joke, despite the fact that Claes Bang, good name, it's Danish, he clears his throat after mentioning Mozart, as though embarrassed. I mention the actor who played Dracula here because I wanted to attribute the throat clearing to him. It seemed like a choice, but it could have been anyone's call. It was a good call because it lessened the damage done to the tone by the writing. Part 13. More workarounds. So the gate was still open. Remember when Van Helsing opened the gate and forbade Dracula from going through? Yeah? Well, the nuns, they go back inside to have their cool nun, God's not gonna save you, you gotta save yourself sermon. And the nuns never closed the gate. So Dracula, having been invited in, enters the scene at super speed, sporting a really fashionable suit and cape, and decapitates Mother Superior with a longsword, or a broadsword, I'm unclear. All the nuns point their crosses at him, naturally. When confronted by the cross, which creates an impassable barrier for him, Dracula summons wolves, who devour the nuns, because, in their arrogance, the nuns didn't close the gate. Why didn't he summon wolves when everybody was in the courtyard? Doesn't matter. Also, and I cannot stress this enough, where did Dracula get his clothes? Did he just summon them to his person? Can he do that? Because if he can do that, why did he just spend an 8-minute scene with his dick out? Is that a power Dracula has? That's never been a power I have heard of Dracula having, just summoning clothes to himself. Generally, in my experience, Dracula just transforms with his clothes. He sure as hell did not have clothes when he was busting out of that wolf. Further, where did he get the sword? We've already established that the monastery has swords hanging on the walls, but generally, if Chekhov says that if you want a character to have a weapon, generally you want to see them get the weapon so that the audience is let in on the sense of dramatic irony. It doesn't matter. Nothing matters. Part 14. You thought it was going to be Jonathan, but it was me, Dio. So upon the massacre of the nuns, Mina is led by Van Helsing into her secret subterranean lab. The pair put down a circle of the host, holy bread, to protect themselves. Then, down the stairs comes Johnny Blue Eyes. Mina begins to cry, as one would, and, despite all of Van Helsing's warnings, she invites Johnny into the circle of bread. But oh no, Johnny Blue Eyes has red eyes now. And when Mina asks Johnny Blue Eyes why he no have blue eyes, he explains, he's inside. Which should be, to Van Helsing, who is supposed to be the smartest person in any given room, with the exception of the now brilliant Dracula, very clear. This should be very clear, especially after she watched Dracula slither out of that wolf. She fails to stop Mina from inviting Johnny Blue Eyes into the circle. Mina then asks, "Why aren't your eyes blue anymore?" And Johnny replies, "They're not my eyes." At which point, Dracula peels off Jonathan Harker's face that he's been wearing like a mask, with a smug grin plastered all over his blood-smeared features, and says to the two women who are understandably screaming their heads off, I would be too, "Hello, I've been dying to meet you." So here we are. We're back at horror elements being undercut with humor. Am I crazy? Peeling off someone's face from your face is pretty spooky, and then slamming in maybe the most smug, stupid joke in the history of vampire humor ruins the moment. Am I the bad guy here? The joke's at a level of camp that is just not supported by the high budget of the series. Dracula 2K20 has no idea what it's trying to be, other than smarter than Dracula. I also know that Dracula feeds only one baby to his brides in the book, despite what I said earlier. And I think that the give me my child scene is a complete wasted opportunity for most Dracula media. It's terrifying. Okay, I've said my piece. I'll see you in episode 2. Blood Vessel. You get it? Do you get it? Cause blood